Getting right into it, this is probably my favorite one on the list. This is the story of Amy Maud Bock. Amy Maud Bock was a Tasmanian codwoman. She was born on the 18th of May in 1859, and her typical pattern was making emotional claims to either her employer or some other person close to her in order to gain their trust and then get their money. Typical scams such as taking someone's watch in order to repair it and then never returning it, or selling fake concert or theater tickets. The interesting thing is, after she would commit these crimes, she would leave the area and then when caught, would just immediately confess. We'll go over many of Amy's crimes, many of the things that she confessed to, most importantly, the reason that she made the list, her scam of impersonating a man in order to marry a wealthy family's daughter. But before we get to that story, let's start with the upbringing and some of the smaller crimes of potentially the most prolific con artist ever, Amy Maud Bock. In 1867, when Amy was 8 years old, her family moved to Sale, Australia. Her mother was in a very fragile mental condition, as well as suffering from many physical ailments. One of the mental ailments her mother had was being convinced that she was Lady Macbeth. I'm not making this up. Her mother had a mental disability that therefore, she was convinced that she was Lady Macbeth from Shakespeare's play, Macbeth. She was committed into a psychiatric institution in 1872. Amy would have been around 13 to 14 at the time, and she died in 1875 when Amy was 16 years old. A school friend of Amy Bock described her as both clever and popular. She also was an accomplished pianist and horsewoman, whatever that may mean. She had a reputation for being a good actor from a young age and often took over the boys' roles in plays. I'm sure you can see where this is going. 1876, at the age of 17, she was sent to a boarding school in Melbourne where she stayed for 2 years. Her family, obviously being her father and other siblings she may have had, were not in the best financial situation, and Amy took up school teaching in order to help her family financially. Over the next decade of her life, Amy was a school teacher. She regularly was absent, claiming illness as the reason for her lack of attendance, and was found on at least 2 separate occasions by school investigators as falsifying the attendance in her classroom in order to inflate her salary. During this time, she also incurred significant debts, and at one point even falsified a letter from her sister to the people attempting to collect the debt, claiming that Amy had died. Obviously, since we're just getting started with the story of the scam she accomplished throughout her life, that was not the case. Over the next several years, she worked many different jobs. Also, she did her number one favorite crime of obtaining goods under false pretenses. This will be a recurring pattern as we go throughout the story, so I'm just going to go ahead and pop up the false pretense number here so that we can keep track. I don't have the exact number that she committed in this time frame, but my source did say multiple times, so we will be generous and start her out with 3. At the age of 27, she was given her first prison sentence, 1 month of hard labor. She had had many previous charges that were dropped due to her family's history of mental illness and a variety of other reasons. On her release, she moved to Wellington, where, of course, she continued her favorite hobby of obtaining goods under false pretenses. She also obtained employment as a matron at an all-boys college, where she used many of her ill-gotten funds in order to purchase boots and other school supplies for the pupils there. This is also going to be a reoccurring pattern with Amy, as many of the crimes she committed, she seemingly did so with no true will to spend the money on herself. It seemed that she would much rather give it away to people that needed it worse than she did. In July of 1887, she appeared before the court again, this time on fraud charges, and was sentenced to 6 months detention at a place that I am not going to pronounce correctly, but Dunedin would be my guess. The governor of the prison was so impressed by her social skills and intelligence that he offered her the position as a teacher within the prison. However, shortly after, he found her planning and engineering her own escape through fictitious letters with her aunt, an aunt that of course did not exist. She was discharged from the prison in January of 1888. Following her release from Dunedin, she began to take up independent music instruction, having been a gifted pianist earlier in her childhood, but once again would fall on the wrong side of the law shortly after. She appeared back in court in April of 1888 for, that's correct, obtaining goods under false pretenses. She was sentenced to another 2 months in prison, despite the fact that she specifically requested to be sent to an asylum, claiming that she had inherited madness and kleptomania from her mother. The judge, of course, this was the time period it was in, commented, and this is a direct quote, "Kleptomania is only another name for stealing." After this sentence, she moved again, was arrested again, and once again sent to prison for obtaining goods under false pretenses. I am genuinely starting to think that she did indeed inherit kleptomania from her mother, and we aren't even a quarter of the way through yet. After her release, she moved again, this time taking on the role of a housekeeper, where shortly after she was caught attempting to pawn off the homeowner's assets. Following the uncovering of this plan, she moved again and was arrested again in May of 1890. Now 31 years old, she represented herself in court, despite, of course, many advising her against it, and confessed guilty on all charges for obtaining goods under false pretenses, and also forging a promissory note. While not too much is documented about the exact nature or specifics of the crime committed, the prosecutor stated about the fraud, quote, "the most cunning scheme that had ever been adopted in the colony." Due to her now immensely long record, she was handed a maximum sentence, 3 years in prison. After serving 2 years and 4 months in prison, she was released early for good behavior. She then, of course, resettled in a new city, which I probably will not pronounce correctly, but Timaru in New Zealand. This was in October of 1892. She almost immediately began presenting herself as a wealthy tourist and borrowed a loan from a local principal, claiming that she had lost her pocketbook. After disappearing with the money, she was quickly caught and imprisoned for 1 month's sentence. This again, obtaining goods under false pretenses. She claimed during the trial that she had been disturbed by the death of her father, who was still alive in Melbourne. After her release, she made her first contact with the Salvation Army and committed several other petty thefts and crimes, including pawning her landlady's husband's watch in April of 1893. This crime, because of her record, landed her another 6 months in prison. On her release in October of 1893, she moved again, big shocker, this time at the request of a friend she had made during her time working with the Salvation Army. She then began to seek out a 6-bedroom house in order to repay her friend for her kindness. She claimed that she had received a substantial inheritance. Of course, we all know, not the case. She also borrowed various sums of money from a local furniture seller and then applied for formal membership into the Salvation Army. The local captain of the Salvation Army was well aware of her history and decided that he would await for proof that she had actually turned her life around. She then proceeded to defraud Salvation Army members out of 30 shillings with, that's correct, selling them false concert tickets, otherwise known as obtaining goods under false pretenses. She then, of course, left the city and moved to a new town called Palmerston. She was, of course, apprehended again, and in January of 1894, sentenced to 4 months of hard labor. This would be her 8th prison sentence in 8 years. After her release in October of 1895, she was again sentenced to prison for not paying her board and lodging, this time only with a sentence of 3 months. After this sentence in early 1896, she was sent to a Catholic home for fallen women. There is no record that I could find of her time at the Catholic home. No record of arrests or her favorite hobby, but I cannot imagine, judging off what I'm about to tell you, that she went 5 years without obtaining goods under false pretenses. I wish that we knew more about this time period at the Catholic home, but unfortunately, we have to go with what the sources allow us to know. It seems around this time that Amy began to dabble in a new hobby: fake identities. Shortly after her 5 years there, she began to use various different fake identities in various different locations. In 1901, she began work as a housekeeper under the pseudonym of Miss Sherwin. Later, she left the town and faked the death of Miss Sherwin in order to avoid repaying debts that she had accumulated there. In 1902, masquerading this time as Miss Mary Shannon in the same city where the Catholic Home for Fallen Women was, she befriended a well-known gardener and nurseryman, and befriended him so much that she was actually welcomed as a guest into his home. Through him, she defrauded more investors, this time convincing them that she needed the money to start a fictitious poultry farm in Mount Roscoe. She was, of course, caught and imprisoned again, this time 2 years prison sentence with hard labor. By this point, Amy had developed a reputation with authorities for being a uniquely moral criminal. Almost all of her ill-gotten gains were given away, particularly to young female servants. The paper even published an article stating that Bock, quote, stands supreme in cleverness over other female criminals. You can almost feel the tinge of the sexism of the time in this quote, because I cannot think of another male criminal that I researched during this time that was able to accomplish what I am about to tell you. And she was almost certainly the most clever criminal to ever grace New Zealand. Bock again earned a reduction in her sentence because of good behavior and was released in October of 1904. Following her release, she was admitted into a Samaritan home, where she left after 2 days. She found work in a new town under the pseudonym of Amy Chanel, but was shortly after arrested for attempting to alter a check. Uncharacteristically, and something that I haven't mentioned with all of the trials previously, only some of them, this is the only time that Amy Bock did not plead guilty to the charges. Every other time that she had been arrested that we've spoken about, she pled guilty on all charges and basically told the court, yeah, I did it, hey. However, she was still convicted by the jury and sentenced to a 3-year sentence. She served 2.5 years, good behavior again, and then took up residence at a Samaritan home. I genuinely think that this situation regarding the altered check could have been a genuine misunderstanding, given that her MO was to commit the crime, flee the scene, get arrested, and plead guilty. I think that there was something deeper inside of her compelling her to do these things, and I just can't imagine a reason that she wouldn't plead guilty to this charge just like she did all of the other charges had there not actually been a misunderstanding. Prison obviously wasn't a big deal to her. Jail time wasn't a big deal to her. In fact, she spent more time there than she did on the outside. So I wish I could know for a fact if she actually committed this crime with intention or if it was simply a misunderstanding. Of course, it would also be a genius attempt on Bock's side if she really didn't want to go to prison this time to plead not guilty, not only for the fact that she would have got a lighter sentencing had she pled guilty, but the jury certainly was aware of her past and also her MO of always pleading guilty. If I was a jury member, I can't say that I wouldn't have led towards not guilty simply due to the fact that she had never lied about it before. In the same year of her release, 1907, she befriended several members of an opera company. They traveled around to different cities performing operas, where along the way, in traveling with the opera company, she committed several other small crimes so that she could be a patron of the company. In 1908, now 48 years of age, she assumed another pseudonym, Agnes Valance, and took up work as a housekeeper once again in the city of Dunedin. During Christmas time, she was left alone and in charge of the household that she was housekeeping for, and it was discovered that she attempted to use the furniture in the home as collateral for a loan under a different pseudonym, not Agnes Valance, but this time under the name of Charlotte Skevington. A warrant was issued for her arrest in the following month, January of 1909, but by this time, Charlotte Skevington, Agnes Valance, Amy Bock were no more. Percival Leonard Carroll Redwood was born. Bock was now posing as an affluent Canterbury sheep farmer, a male by the name of Percy Redwood. She became a popular guest in a respectable boarding house in the town of Dunedin. I'm sure the name of the town is starting to sound familiar, as this not only was a town that she lived in, but a town that she committed crimes in, was arrested in many different times for many different occasions, and just a month prior was arrested for the scandal of using the furniture in order to obtain a loan. This was the same city. She now simply was operating under a different image with a different name. Keep in mind that that incident where she had the warrant issued for her arrest was only 1 month prior. After several weeks of being Percival, she traveled to the southeastern coast of Australia and began wooing a young woman by the name of Agnes Ottaway. Agnes was the daughter of the landlady of Albion House, a large private guest house that was extremely popular for tourism at the time. Seeing the potential in the upcoming scheme, sought to make her fake identity as foolproof as possible, forging letters from lawyers and family members of Percival Redwood in order to make the con more convincing. Percy and Ottaway married in April of 1909 at a large wedding with over 200 guests in attendance, let alone a local member of parliament, if that gives you any idea as to the type of family that Percival, or Amy, was marrying into. At the very last moment, Percival's family wrote letters apologizing and stating that they would be unable to attend the wedding ceremony. Suspicions were raised not only by the lack of Percy's family attending the wedding, but also Percy's inability to repay his debts prior to the marriage. The morning after the wedding ceremony, Agnes Ottaway's parents, as well as some family friends, confronted Percy about his finances and gave him a 1-week grace period to pay off all of his debts, on the basis that they would not pay for a honeymoon until he had done so. Two other friends of the family, also being suspicious with the interesting character of Percival Redwood, began to make their own inquiries into Percy's background. They found themselves unable to trace the lineage, let alone the existence, of Percy's mother. They reported these things to the police, and the local police officer there immediately began to recognize some of the signs of one Amy Bock. He asked for the friends of the family to show him a picture, and of course recognized her immediately. I find it incredibly funny that someone began telling the story to the police officer, and right away he knew who was responsible for the situation. Like, oh yeah, I know. Say no more. I understand what's going on here. It's this young lady, her name is Amy Bock, and every single person that she comes into contact with, she scams them. I imagine that he had a framed picture of her on his desk or maybe in his drawer, and when people would come in to report a crime or being defrauded, that he would just turn the old picture around, the people would start breaking down like, yes, that's her, that's her. An old sheriff would just let out a deep sigh. 3 days after the wedding, Bock was arrested at the Ottaway's guest house, and one of the papers covering the trial described her as, quote, rather good looking. You can be the judge for yourself. Bock pled guilty to all charges, of course, and was convicted of obtaining goods under false pretenses. Also included in these charges were her crimes during the Christmas season as Agnes Valance, and also making a false declaration under the Marriage Act. She was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment with hard labor. By this time, she was considered a habitual criminal by the government, something that I imagine they could have imposed on her much sooner. This meant that she would be detained in prison until such a time that, quote, "The governor is convinced that she can be granted her liberty with perfect safety to the public." She was only the second woman in the history of New Zealand to ever have been titled a habitual criminal. In a summary of her previous convictions given to the court by the prosecutor, it was noted that she had been convicted on 13 separate occasions. Agnes Ottaway petitioned for the Supreme Court to annul the marriage given the circumstances, something which they obviously complied with, and the events of Bock's marriage, of course, obtained instant notoriety. It was covered in many magazines and newspapers, all with different angles on what may have happened, who was to blame, and the reason for the scam. Items from the wedding were even auctioned off to the public in May of 1909, with Otago Daily Times, a newspaper from the area, stating the auction rooms were, quote, "packed to suffocation with spectators." Postcards of Amy Bock were sold by local entrepreneurs. In 1910, a wharf worker brought a private prosecution to the court, stating that another wharf worker persistently insulted him by calling him, quote, "Amy Bock." The defendant wharf worker was charged with the crime and forced to pay the wharf worker, being referred to as Amy, 20 shillings. Bock's behavior in prison was once again exemplary, and she was released early due to good behavior, this time in February of 1912. She was 52 years old. She was still released early in spite of her having been denoted as a habitual criminal, which testifies as to just how well she must have been able to portray herself, or rather, how well she must actually have been as a person during her time in prison. Upon her release, she worked in a retirement home and then once again relocated to a small town. Upon her release, she worked in a retirement home and then relocated again, working now as a housemaid in a much smaller city. She also assisted the teachers of the local schools and became a popular, well-known, and by all accounts, well-beloved figure in that community. She married in November of 1914, this time as herself, rather than Percy Redwood, and as a result, she was granted an unconditional discharge of her probation in 1915. However, due to the debts that Amy Bock had already accrued during the time, the marriage fell through 2 years later.
You thought it was over.
Not quite. In March of 1917, Bock appeared again in court. She admitted to having obtained £15 from a local mill manager in order to afford a piano. Once again, the fraud charges were obtaining goods under false pretenses. Due to her good behavior in the years prior to this incident, rather than being sentenced again to prison, she was simply fined. She lived quietly in a small town for several years after that, being known for her musical ability. Maybe she did actually need the money for that piano. It was not until 1931, 14 years after her previous appearance in court, now aged 71, that Amy Bock would end up on the wrong side of the law once again. She appeared to the court on 5 charges of obtaining goods under false pretenses, where she, of course, pled guilty to all charges. Bock was given a 2-year probationary sentence in October of 1931, conditional on her residence at the Salvation Army. There is no record of her time there, and essentially nothing is known how or where she spent her final years of life. She died in Auckland in August of 1943 at the ripe old age of 84 years, and she was buried in an unmarked grave in a public cemetery. Thus marks the end of Percy Redwood and, of course, the infamous and my personal favorite from this list, Amy Bock. Now moving on to the female wizard of finance, Cassie Chadwick. Her occupations are listed on Wikipedia as clairvoyant, fortune teller, and pimp, but she was so much more than that. Born as Elizabeth Bigley in 1844 in Canada, over the course of her life, she stole approximately $330,000, more than $20 million in today's dollars, and wreaked havoc on the Ohio financial and banking system. She was the third daughter in a family of 2 boys and 6 girls, and shortly after she was born, her family moved to a farm in eastern Canada. And 3 years after she was born, her parents moved her and her siblings to a farm in Canada West. At only 14 years old, Cassie opened an account at Ontario Bank using a forged letter of inheritance. She was arrested, but similar to Amy Bock's early schemes, was quickly released on the grounds of insanity. Maybe it was really easy to get away with crimes back then if you were a woman. I think that they just assumed that all women were just insane and had no malintent when it comes to conning people. Maybe that's why they were so successful. Cassie also began scamming other people using a set of business cards that she had either printed or made or had someone else print. The card read, this is not a joke, quote, Miss Bigley, heiress to $15,000. She made many expensive purchases using the cards as collateral, as during this time you could buy things from many stores just on credit, and store owners had no reason to disbelieve her claim and thought that why would she carry this around if she wasn't actually the heiress to $15,000? Which in today's time seemed so silly. She briefly served time in a prison in Illinois due to her fraudulent dealings, and shortly after made her way to Ohio. When she arrived in Cleveland in 1880, she lived briefly with her sister prior to opening up her own space as a clairvoyant, now using the pseudonym Madame Lydia DeVere. A few years after moving to Cleveland, Cassie married a Dr. Springsteen, and due to the marriage, took the name Lydia Springsteen due to her practicing her clairvoyancy as Madame Lydia DeVere. However, after a local newspaper published something about the marriage, many of Lydia's creditors, Cassie's creditors, or Elizabeth's creditors, it's going to be hard to keep up with different names at this point, but Elizabeth Bigley, Cassie Chadwick, many of her creditors began to come to the house, at which point the husband had had enough. Dr. Springsteen threw Cassie out of the house and filed for divorce, but not before paying off her debts. Must have been a good guy. The marriage lasted only 12 days. After the dissolution of the marriage, she of course reestablished herself as a clairvoyant, now under the name Madame Marie LaRose, where shortly after she married John R. Scott, a local farmer from Trumbull County, Ohio, who she convinced to sign a prenuptial agreement stating previous abuse from her prior husband. Keep in mind, the prenuptial agreement that she would have had him sign is based in her ability to be able to divorce him. Because of the time period she was in, it would not have been possible for her to get a divorce from her husband without either having him divorce her or express consent from the both of them. Thus, her convincing him to sign a prenuptial agreement. I think you can see where this is going. After 4 years of life on the farm, she went to a lawyer in Youngstown, Ohio, where she confessed to committing adultery and filed for divorce. As far as I can tell, I don't know if she actually ever did commit adultery, but rather needed a reason and needed to have that reason sworn in writing so that she was then able to divorce her husband due to the prenuptial agreement. Her first fraud case came in 1889, and unfortunately for Cassie Chadwick, and also highlighting the extreme luckiness, I guess you could call it, of Amy Bock. It was different countries, but still, she was sentenced to 9.5 years in a penitentiary in Toledo. The crime that she had committed was a forgery, and she was paroled in 1893, only serving 4 years of the sentence before being released. When she was released, she of course returned back to Cleveland, and upon returning to Cleveland, she began to operate under a new pseudonym, Miss Cassie Hoover. She then opened a brothel on the west side of the city, and at that brothel is where she would meet her next husband. He was a wealthy widower doctor named Leroy Chadwick. Chadwick began to play the role of a respectable widow who ran a house for damaged and widowed women. When Leroy responded that the establishment she was talking about was a brothel, Cassie responded, as you could imagine, in complete and total shock, acting as if she knew nothing of the things happening within the brothel in which she was the operator. It's even cited that upon being told that it was a brothel, she fainted in front of Dr. Chadwick. Once she woke back up, she begged Dr. Chadwick to take her from the building so that no one could ever think that she could possibly be attached to such a looked-down-upon establishment, let alone let anyone think that she was complicit in its operation. Thus began the life of Cassie Chadwick, the female wizard of finance. In 1897, Cassie married Dr. Chadwick, and it is unknown, really, if Dr. Chadwick was aware that she, during the first few years of marriage, had given birth to a son under the name Emil Hoover. The son, not Cassie. I know she has a lot of names. Emil Hoover is Cassie Hoover's son, who's now Cassie Chadwick, who was the two madames, and before that was born as Elizabeth Bigley. When she was charged with forgery, she identified herself before the court as being single with no children, but later, in the census of 1900, listed herself as Cassie Chadwick, born in February of 1862 in Pennsylvania, being both married and having a son. Her son was enumerated in the census as Emil Chadwick. Keep in mind, she was not born in 1862. She's shaving a couple years off, trying to stay young there in the census, as she was actually born in 1857, not in Pennsylvania, but in Canada. Because of Dr. Chadwick's success in his profession and in the public, she lived on a street known as Millionaires Row, where she attempted to become friends and gain the favor of many of others of the rich people that lived in Ohio. However, the elites, such as the Rockefellers and several other names that aren't as important, saw her as someone who vainly sought to seek their favor rather than someone that actually fit in. When she was invited to the social events of the elites, it was out of respect for her husband rather than the actual desire to have Cassie attend. All of that is great and very important backstory for what I'm about to tell you, because without the marriage and these connections, she would never have been able to commit the level and the quantity of money scammed that she was able to do. There's a reason that I said one of the greatest con artists in history. Cassie Chadwick, following the marriage and moving in, becoming present with the elites, began one of the greatest cons ever known, convincing the public and the financial system that she was the illegitimate daughter of one Andrew Carnegie. Yes, that Andrew Carnegie. During a visit to New York City, she asked one of her husband's acquaintances, a lawyer, to take her to the residence of Andrew Carnegie. While she was there, all she really did was speak with one of Carnegie's housekeepers. But upon her return to the lawyer, when he picked her back up from Carnegie's residence, she accidentally dropped a piece of paper on the floor in front of him. Dylan, upon picking up the note, noticed that it was a $2 million promissory note signed by Andrew Carnegie himself. When Dylan promised to keep Cassie Chadwick's secret, she revealed to him that she was the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie. This, of course, being completely fictitious, but he promised to keep her secret. According to Cassie, Andrew Carnegie was so racked by the guilt of having an illegitimate child and not being able to take care of her that he showered her with money in order to make up for his lack of being an attentive father. She also claimed that she had $7 million worth of promissory notes tucked away, as well as she was written into Andrew Carnegie's will and was going to be the future benefactor of $400 million upon his death. Dylan arranged for a safe deposit box for the document, and Cassie Chadwick returned to Ohio. This information leaked to the financial institutions and banks in Ohio, as Cassie had planned for it to, and they immediately began throwing their services at her. For the next 8 years, she used this fake background to obtain large loans from banks. They eventually totaled around $2 million, which is about the equivalent of $68 million today. Keep in mind, it wasn't until 1974 that women were, by law, able, and the banks couldn't turn them away, to open their own bank accounts or to obtain loans from the bank without a male figure also co-signing. She had managed to get today's equivalent of $68 million in loans given to her with no real way to repay them by the banks at a time where she wasn't even able to have her own checking account. She relied on two assumptions primarily. One, that no one would ask Andrew Carnegie about her illegitimate daughter for fear of causing him embarrassment. No one wants to do that with a powerful man. And two, the bankers charged her ridiculous interest rates on the loan, assuming that when Andrew Carnegie passed away, all of her debts would be taken care of. That means that they were not necessarily willing to freely give up the information to begin with, because they would basically set themselves up to get in trouble for, one, giving out a loan with an insane interest rate, and two, being idiots and falling for the scam. She carried out a lavish lifestyle as a result of the con. Bought jewelry, diamond necklaces, enough clothes to fill over 30 closets, and became known as the Queen of Ohio. In November of 1904, Cassie Chadwick received a loan for $190,000 from a banker in Brookline, Massachusetts. The banker's name was Newton, and when Newton found out just how many loans had already been issued to Cassie, he began to get a little bit suspicious, let alone nervous. And so he called for the immediate repayment of the loan that he had provided to her, which of course she was unable to pay back, so he decided to sue. When Carnegie was asked about her later, he said that he had no idea of this person existing, let alone he had not signed a promissory note in over 30 years. She immediately fled to New York, but was arrested at her hotel and extradited back to Ohio. When she was arrested, she was wearing a money belt totaling $100,000. A physical belt made out of $100 bills, stacks, totaling $100,000 at the time of her arrest. Dr. Chadwick and his daughter immediately left Ohio for shame of what had happened, and he filed for divorce before leaving the city. The news sent shockwaves through the financial institutions of Cleveland. Citizens National Bank of Oberlin, which had loaned her $800,000, suffered a massive bank run and had to file for bankruptcy. During Cassie's trial, Andrew Carnegie even attended because he was so curious about the woman that had been able to pull off this scam and assert herself as his illegitimate daughter in order to obtain all of this wealth. Other attendees of the trial included the families from Millionaires Row, who she had previously tried so hard to fall into their good graces with. Needless to say, the trial was a media circus, and in March of 1905, a Cleveland court sentenced her to 14 years in prison and a fine of $70,000 for conspiracy to bankrupt the Citizens National Bank and conspiracy against the government, due to Citizens National Bank being a federally chartered institution. On the 1st of January in 1906, almost a year after the trial, Cassie was sent to Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus. She brought with her to the prison trunks of goods, including clothes, photographs, and furniture. The warden allowed her to bring these things due to her now near celebrity status. As her health deteriorated while in jail, Cassie began writing detailed expectations for her funeral. She instructed in a letter for her son Emil to use some of her tucked away funds in order to purchase a tombstone at the family plot, and on the 17th of September in 1907, she suffered a nervous collapse that left her blind for the rest of her life. Cassie Chadwick died on her 50th birthday. Not Cassie Chadwick's 50th birthday, but the 50th birthday of the actual human being, Elizabeth Bigley, on the 10th of October, 1907. Thus is the story of the female wizard of finance, Cassie Chadwick. If you're still watching the video, please subscribe. It helps me out a ton and encourages me to make more of these. This is not the only con artist, scam artist video I will be making because I have been doing research on all of these and there is more than enough. Obviously, this video is getting pretty long, so I'm going to make this a couple different parts. And if you want to watch the remaining con/scam artists, subscribe so you don't miss it. I will see you guys soon. So